Okay, so we have this is our final show for the season, and we look forward to resuming, in September. Then we'll be learning Masachet Yevamos, which is a very fascinating Masachet.
Are there really seasons in Torah learning?
That's a great point. Not really.
Are there playoffs?
Daf Yomi goes on year round.
What's that? Oh, yeah, that's true. Tmid and Kasidron, as they say. Right? Well, since you're asking, so, the Tosis in Brachos and Daf Yud Aleph on the base raises a very important question. Because the background is like typically when you make a bracha and then you perform a mitzvah of some sort, so you're not allowed to, if there's an interruption that breaks the continuity, you have to make the bracha all over again. So, for example, if you're wearing tefillin and then you take it off, not just for a minute, but for a long break, or talis, or if you eat in the sukkah, and then you leave the sukkah and you're only going to come back for the next meal, so you always make an independent bracha. So the Bali Tosis ask, why is that not true typically when it comes to Talmud Torah, when it comes to Torah study? In other words, let's say you make Birchas HaTorah, which most people do in the morning, together with the other brachos that we make before Shacharis. So you say Lasot b'divrei Torah v'harevna b'asher b'achar b'ana mikalo amim. You say all of those, and that's why, by the way, the practice is, and this is in our Sidurim already, and this is widely accepted, that you say a pasuk Yivrach Hashem v'yishmerecha, and then you say Elu Devarim shein lahem shir, Mishnah in Peah, and so on. So, because you're making the Birchas HaTorah, and then immediately you, if you were not going to follow up with reading some psukim or mishnayos or whatever, it would be a hefsek and it would be a bracha levatala. So at least that's the thinking, and therefore we do. But then what happens if after davening is over or whatever, and then people go off to work, and then let's say they come back for a shiur at night or maybe earlier, but there'd been several hours in which they were in business or doing other things that were necessary for the day. So shouldn't they really repeat Birchas HaTorah when they sit down anew to study? After all, for hours and hours they've been doing something else. And again, if we were talking about Leisha Basukah or tefillin or tzitzis, you would have to make a new bracha. So why not when it comes to Torah study? So actually, the brother of the Shibali Aleket, which is a medieval work, Italy actually, Ashkenaz though, early Ashkenaz. So he quotes his, I think one of his brothers, who said you don't have to say like a Birchas HaTorah when you return to the Safsala Limudim, as they say, when you return to study. So there were some authorities who claimed that you do, but the practice in Klal Yisrael has always been that you don't. So the consensus view seems to be that you don't need to, and the question is to explain it, to reconstruct the thinking behind it. So Rabbeinu Tam in Tosis and Brachos, Aleph Amud Beis, says the reason is because rare among the mitzvos, unique among the mitzvos, he doesn't venture to, go into that part of it. The study of Torah, the mitzvah to study Torah, is a constant obligation. It's a chiyuv tmidi. So there's no mitzvah to be in the sukkah all day, and there's no mitzvah to wear talis or tefillin. I mean, it's nice. You might fulfill a mitzvah. There could be good reason to be wearing a talis and tefillin and spend a lot of time in the sukkah, etc. But mostly these are mitzvos that, are connected to a particular performance. And on an obligatory level, anyway, the chiyuv, is more finite. But the Rabbeinu Tam says when it comes to the study of Torah, that is something that doesn't really end. That it's obligatory. So what he says is that's the reason why you don't make a separate Birchas HaTorah, because even though you may not have been studying in the interim, in the end of the day, you were obligated to study, so you're still connected to this obligation and the bracha that you made in the beginning of the day, to initiate it. So why am I telling you all this? Because you're asking me whether there are seasons in in study of Torah, and then I think the suggestion was made that the Daf Yomi continues. So you're both right. I mean, a very strong view in the in the sources is that Talmud Torah is unique and that it is a constant and continuous obligation. And the reason that is so is very obvious too, and that is because we say Talmud Torah keneged kulam, that Torah study is the equivalent of everything else. It's an interesting phrase, keneged, as opposed to, or we say shivisi Hashem lenegdi tamid. What do I mean, keneged kulam or lenegdi tamid? It's an interesting phrase. Ezer kenegdo. We speak about marriage, in an ideal way, as being, the wife is the Ezer Kenegdo. She is the helpmeet, I guess they call it, opposite to him, as, or opposite him. So what does Kenegdo mean? Shivisi Hashem Kenegdi, Ezer Kenegdo, Talmud Torah Keneged Ula. So I think what it means is, in all cases, not, on the other side, but it's a balancing. It's what provides perspective. So a good marriage, is not a marriage of clones. It's not a marriage of incompatibles. It's a marriage of people who have a lot in common, but also have diverse strengths and perspectives. Simply the gender differentiation, itself, of course, has always been understood to reflect, a very healthy balance. So in that sense, a good marriage is an Ezer, but it's Kenegdo, somebody who is different, two people who are on the same side, but who bring to the table, in addition to their commonalities, they bring things that are also Kenegdo, that balance each other out and that provide a perspective, for both of them. And that's what we say, Shivisi Hashem lenegdi tamid. That whatever you do during the day, you should always have the picture of the Ribono Shel Olam, kenegdecha, that's your goal, that's your objective. And whatever conflicting pressures, forces, etc., you have to contend with during your day or during your lifetime, that having that image and that goal and the perspective and the, that is supplied by that, is crucial. So that's what we mean. Also, we say Talmud Torah keneged kula. We don't only mean that it's epistemologically attains the highest value. We mean that it in addition, one of the reasons it's so important is because it's the kenegdi factor. Talmud Torah is really the source of our values, because when you study Torah and you understand it deeply, so it isn't just it's also, but it's not only intellectually curious, and it's not only a blueprint for performing mitzvos and keeping the halacha loyally, It's all those things. It's a little mode amadas lasos, and it's certainly intellectually enriching and spiritually enriching. But the most important thing is that it gives you insight into what it is that you're supposed to be doing, and into the halachic system, and it's what allows you to turn your commitment into a value system. So in that sense, Talmud Torah is keneged kulam. Everything requires Talmud Torah to kind of decipher or put in perspective what it is. So for that reason, maybe unique among the mitzvos, it's a constant obligation. I mentioned in the past, say Kishem Hashem Ekra Havu Godel Elokeinu, that the Birchas HaTorah, the source of Birchas HaTorah, the Gemara says in Brachos, Daf Chaf Aleph Aleph, is a pasuk, that appears in the Shira in the end of the Torah. Kishem Hashem Ekra Havu Godel Elokeinu. I call the name of the Ribono Shel Olam, right? Havu Godel Elokeinu, and therefore you should give praise, to his name, to his to God, to his divinity. So, according to the Ramban, this is pasuk, and this is a requirement that's min Torah. So it's I always like to point out, it's a very remarkable thing. If I told you that the source of making a bracha before you do the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is from the pasuk Kishem Hashem Ekra, you're going to call God's name. So you would look at me, I don't know, askance, or at least confused. You're studying Bava Kama, or we're studying Gittin. Next year, it looks like we're going to be studying Ivamos. What does that have to do with calling out God's name? But that's what it is. We don't, what we know of the Ribono Shel Olam is what he has revealed to us. And the greatest revelation is the Torah that he's given us, and the concepts that are, embedded in Torah, and the values that they reflect. So the bracha that you make on Torah study is really a bracha on the understanding of and connection with the Ribono Shel Olam. So that's why, Rabbi Tam can say that even if you haven't been actually studying, and you haven't had your Masechet Gittin open, since the morning, or even then, you just said Yivrecha Hashem Yishmerecha and El Dvarim Shein Lem Shir, but and then it's 7 hours later you're returning to study and study something else. Nonetheless, there's no real hefsek, there's no interruption, there's no disruption, because really, this is, as you say, there's no season to end. That doesn't mean that there aren't milestones along the way, that every time you finish a topic, and every time you finish, at least temporarily, the study of a Masechta, that's something that's why they are siyumim, and these are milestones that we appreciate, and that we celebrate. But again, you gave the example of the Daf Yomi. On the one hand, it continues every day. It's a very, what is it they say, a marathon, right? I don't do it, but I admire the people who do. But it's a marathon, and it requires a lot of commitment and a lot of stamina, like a real marathon requires that. On the other hand, along the way, there are milestones. And the idea that you make a siyum not only the end of Shas, but first of all, there's a siyum in the end of Shas, but there are siyumim in the Masechtas and in the Sdarim, along the way as well. So I think, that's kind of where we are right now. So we've been spending the year studying different themes, not in order for sure. We started a little bit backwards at the end of the Masechta, literally, and we've been jumping around. What I've tried to do most of the year is really focus on the bigger themes, not only of Gittin, but of Shtaros and contracts and Eidos, testimony. These are big questions, not only because they affect Jewish divorce and marriage, but because, again, going back to what I said before, even though I said it for a different reason, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, they provide a perspective on Kishem Hashem Ekra Havu Godel Elokeinu, on life for us. They are like the building blocks of our hashkafa, of our Weltanschauung, of our worldview. So understanding, like, when do we trust people? When do we don't have the luxury of simply relying on their word? When do we need more? Like, what are the rules about eidos and shtaros and edekiyum and edebirur, and what is the status of personal identity and in marriage and in divorce? All these things are, I hope they've been fascinating, intellectually, themes. But even more important than that is they provide like a real window into like halachic values and halachic thinking, which really is something that defies any kind of other. There are analogies along the way, things you can compare to and contrast to. Sometimes it's similar, sometimes it's different. But taken as a whole, I think when you study any area of Jewish law, we're struck, by how even when the halacha relates to universal or very human, endemically human, issues, it always seems to have, its own perspective. And it stands out in terms of, its idealism, its sophistication, and especially its function in elevating man, and propelling him, into a relationship, with transcendence. So this is our last cheer for the season, but right, by no means, are we closing the books, either on personal study or even on these topics and this masachet. But since there's so much rich, material out there and themes and topics, so we try to mix it up a little bit and, every year pick a different track date. But there's much, much more to discuss in Gittin, certainly, and the enthusiasm and the commitment to plumbing the profundity of the principles is something that, of course, should never end. And Mirz Hashem is when we continue this year going forward next year. We'll continue in that guise as well. Anyway, that's all because you said to me that there's no seasonality. I'm usually, not the one who introduces, the tangents, but today I probably went on one a little longer than I should have. But yeah, so now they'll go back to our topic to make a few more comments about it. But it looks like you have something you want to ask. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So, Rabbi, it's absolutely fascinating that Torah can add Kuram. And would you say that this is one of the key explanations for the survival of Am Yisrael?
Oh, for sure. I think it's a great point, and I think it's totally true. This is the common, denominator that we have, clung to tenaciously from the very beginning, and it's provided, inspiration, and it's identified us, uniquely as a people, and it's also allowed us to, to weather all sorts of challenging circumstances. I'm talking about anti-Semitism, but also equally challenging things. And this is, unfortunately, we have a rise in anti-Semitism, but even more dangerous than anti-Semitism in our time, as we know, is acculturation. And of course, intermarriage, just on a pure identity level, that's an acute expression of it. But even without that, the acculturation of, living in cultures that have many admirable things, for sure, but they're not always in tune with what has defined Jewish existence for millennia. So I think you're totally right, and that's what I meant when I said, these are where our values come from, and this is how we, bond with and create a meaningful connection with the Ribono Shel Olam. And my father, Zechron Livracha, who loved, was a Rav for all the years and loved Torah study, but also side by side, loved Jewish history. He was a professor of Jewish history, and he always used to speak about how, especially in the last couple of 100 years, all the professional historians, Toynbee, and all the naysayers were writing what he called the epitaph, of the Jewish people. And Baruch Hashem, every time they write us off, there's a renaissance. And we're hardly triumphalists. We have a lot of problems and a lot of attrition and a lot of challenges going forward. So we're certainly not triumphalists, but we should be proud that we have withstood, the epitaph writing, at least. And Medinas Yisrael is a thriving and healthy place with many challenges, as we know. Life in the United States, Jewish life in the United States, is very challenged, but also at the same time, has also flourished and produced magnificent things. So yeah, I think that is absolutely true. I think this has been the key and will continue to be the key to, there's a famous Gemara in the end of Masechet Brachos, where Rabbi Akiva, speaks about Jewish survival. And, he gives the famous mashal of, the fox, and the fish. I'm sure everybody's familiar with it. How the fox tries to entice the fish, to leave the water, and the water, of course, is a metaphor for Torah study, a mayim el Torah. And, the idea here is that when there were persecutions and imposed sanction against, Torah study, so Rabbi Akiva was saying, listen, it's true that, pikuach nefesh, when your life is at stake, then you have a lot of license, to do things to save your life. However, complying with a decree that disallows Torah study, he was arguing, is the equivalent of national suicide, and that's what the mashal was. In other words, the fox says to the fish, I'll leave you alone. I'll let you survive if you leave the water. And, Rabbi Akiva was saying, if you leave the water, you certainly die, because the fish can't exist outside of that habitat. So your best chance, even from a survival point of view, is to remain in the water, and meaning to continue to be nourished by, by Jewish teaching and study and everything that, and whatever hardships you face, at least you have, a chance, in that framework. But the second that we acquiesce, that we, turn our back on what makes us singular and unique, then, certainly, there's no future. So yeah, 100%. I think it's a great point.
Rabbi, you mentioned Toynbee, and it reminds me of that wonderful debate that actually was written up from Yaakov Herzog,
Right.
who took on the greatest historian of one of the greatest historians of the 20th century, and an incredible rebuttal of
Right.
basically.
Great. Well, Yaakov Herzog was a very special person. He really, his father was a chief rabbi of, of Herzog, and who was a remarkable Talmud Chacham and a scholarly person and a worldly person. And, Yaakov Herzog was did amazing things for Medinat Yisrael, but he himself was, of that world. He was a Talmud Chacham, and it's very much his father's, son. So yeah, that was a very remarkable.
Well, I think we've distracted you enough from your class, Rabbi. I think we should let you teach what you came to teach.
Yes, Okay, so we've been discussing the issue of Erecha Neman Be'isurin, which is a universal theme in the halacha. It's a very broad theme, and it goes to what I was talking about before, which is the questions of credibility and evidence. When and what level of rigor is required in terms of reliance upon other people in order to comply with religious standards. So when it comes to matters of personal status, which are very, very consequential, as we've been discussing, ishus, gitin, and kiddushin, and so on, there you require evidence, edus, testimony. And testimony means in courts, and it means according to very strict laws of disqualification or qualification and disqualification, no relatives, no nobody who's turned their back, religiously, in a significant way, and so on. Nobody who has any interest, financial interest, in the case. That's called nogea b'davar, krovim, psulim. On the other hand, when it comes to eidos, as we've been explaining, we treat eidos as if it is, simply truth, not likely, credible, but absolutely credible. That's a halachic perspective, in that, as I've indicated, the halacha knows that there are, that there's less than 100% reliability of witnesses, but it's a halacha, it's the halachic approach to project 100%, when there is cheskes kashrus of eidos, because this is, for the system to work, there needs to be standards, and there needs to be, at that point, reliability. You can't be looking over your shoulder and doubting, everything that takes place. And testimony, the faith in man, or faith in religious man, and his, impeccable honesty, lies at the heart of this view that eidos is emes, or eidos is mitzius, it's reality. Eidos is a fact. However, so that's required in davar shebe'erva, in gitin and kiddushin, and that's required in anything that affects punishment, or any kind of, certainly capital offenses or malchus or anything like that. But even when it comes simply to dini mamonis, we have this principle of motzi v'chavero, olav haraya, that if you want to, we talked about this a lot last year, if you want to extract, funds, from your neighbor, the onus, is on you. You're the one who have to prove, that you're deserving, and that he owes you money. So anything less than shnai medim is mostly, in a regular din Torah, even in din imamis, you require shnai medim. However, there's another category called erecha neman be'isurim, and that's what we've been discussing the last couple of weeks. Right? It comes up in our topics in Gittin, because the whole first parak, or the first 1.5 prakim of Gittin, discuss the requirement of b'fanei nachtam. If a shliach, if an agent of the husband is delivering the get, and he comes from Medina Sayam to Eretz Yisrael, so he has to say b'fanei nachtam. And the question that the Gemara deals with in the beginning of Gittin is why do we believe him? He's only one individual. Typically, eidos requires shnai. So the Gemara weighs whether or not this might not be a case of what's called erecha neman be'isur. Erecha neman be'isur means, if we're not talking about onshim, punishments, and we're not talking about personal stats, and we're not talking about extracting, financial, assets, but we're talking simply about isur v'heter, kashrus, or other prohibitions that have no monetary or personal status component. So then the rule typically is erecha neman be'isur. If we're not sure whether a piece of meat is kosher or not, then we rely on an Eid Echad. If we're not sure, whether or not, somebody is in a state of Tumma or Tahara, and that has impact on certain things. So that can be resolved on the basis of an Eid Echad, a single Eid. Moreover, that doesn't require a Bezdin. Eidus, real Eidus, Shnayim Eidim, for Mammon, for Onshim, for Erva, all that requires the framework of a Bezdin. The Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim is something that can take place anywhere, right? These are issues that come up and that are consequential in daily life. And it's in daily life, outside of the precincts of a Bezdin, where they need to be resolved. And what we say is Eid Echad is Neman B'Yisurim. A single witness has enough credibility when it comes to Isur. So the question is, and this is what we've been discussing for the last 2 weeks, is how do we intellectually understand, right, this category, and especially in relation to the requirement of 2 witnesses in the other categories. Meaning, one way to look at it would be to say, well, for things where the stakes are higher, you require, certainty, or the legal equivalent of certainty. For issues, which are of lesser consequence, lesser weight, you can get away with, you don't need certainty. You can get away with, probability, let's just say it that way, or something like that. Meaning you don't need 100% proof. You need, or proof that we consider to be 100%, worth 100%. But, we can acknowledge that, that 1 is less than 2. And as we'll see, that not in the Bezdin, is less compelling than, a statement that takes place in a Bezdin, that the statement of someone, assuming this is the case, and we'll get back to it, who is not even kosher le'edus, let's say a karov, a relative, is less convincing than the statement of somebody who, is a rachok, is not related in any way. We can acknowledge all of that and say, however, since we're not talking about a dispute between people or personal status, that lingers and that impacts, you're married, you're not married, et cetera, or onshim, or mammon, et cetera, since none of that is at stake. So even acknowledging that there is some sort of a compromise or a concession when it comes to the standard, it's still acceptable that we operate with that lower standard. Lower risks justify lower standards. That's one perspective. The other way to look at it is to say that, actually, we're, even if we were to acknowledge that it isn't actually on the level of Eidus, maybe Eidus itself is somewhat inflated, or is just, a very, exceptionally rigorous, threshold. But in the end of the day, when it comes to Isurim, it's based on credibility. And, there's almost like a, humanistic, element to it. Like we assume people to be honest, we assume people to be good, all things being equal. We know that there are exceptions, that people, can be corrupted. There's no question about that. But, all things being equal, default, our presumption is that people are telling the truth. And it's not that we're saying, we're not sure, and we're not really just that you can rely on it. We're sure. We're not certain on the level of Eidos, but we are certain given the stakes involved. It's like saying that Eidos is a chiddush, ve'ein lecha bo ele chidusho, and that requires more. But Eid Echad be'isurim, is plenty fine, standard, and there's no reason to second guess it in any way either. So that is what we're in the middle of discussing. Seems to be a major argument and debate, and it seems to impact several issues. Number one, do you need a source to establish Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim? Or is it just, logical? and can be based on even our experience. So the Bali Tosas, all over Shas, including here in Gittin on base of base, and Yevamos on Dapezayin on base, all over the place, essentially. In Nida, in Ksuvis, Chulin, the Bali Tosas, many places say two things. Number one, you need a source. Erechonem Bisurim, has to be demonstrated. It's not just logic. Number one, that's number one. Whereas Rashi in Chulin does quote a source, but it's not a real source. Rashi just says that when the Torah says v'zavachta or v'shachatata, referring to ritual slaughter, and creating kosher meat, there's nothing there that says that we believe an eid echad be surim. But I think what Rashi has in mind is the Torah didn't say, beyond telling us that you have to slaughter the meat, the Torah did not say you have to slaughter the meat and you have to be able to prove it, to the consumer. The Torah didn't say, that in addition to doing a proper shechita, you need, kashrus police, in every home or in every synagogue or in every neighborhood. And therefore, that omission tells you something. What it likely tells you. And then Rashi goes on to say in Chulin, after all, he says, the Torah, number one, knows how to spell out the requirement of evidence and witnesses when it needs to. And it does. But we should learn from where it does that is the chiddush and that anything else doesn't require it. Because the Torah says, Al pi shnayim edim yakum davar mimamon, when it's a matter of capital offense or it's a matter of dinei mamonos, we say ein davar shebe'erva pachas mishnayim, davar. So where the Torah requires to, it tells us. And the implication is that otherwise you don't need to. Not because, reluctantly or, we're, ambivalent even about it. Just that we believe people have a good track record. So if you look at Rashi in Chulin, that's what he says. Rashi in Gittim just says that the source for Erechonem Bisurim is what we see every day in our homes and in our communities. And that is that people rely on the credibility of others. So that isn't the source. Not if you mean by source, prove it to me, otherwise it's not true. Default, you can't rely until you, establish that you can, then saying, we see, just look around. This is what the Jewish community has always done. Puk chazia madavar kind of a thing. That's not a proof. That could be a problem. It's not much of an indication, either. In Yevamos, as we noted, Rashi goes even a giant step further. Right there, Rashi says, listen, Enach is never bisurim, because if it wasn't, how could you rely, even in your own household, on your wife, on your son, on your parents, right? You wouldn't be able to rely on anybody if Echad wasn't them and bisurim. So again, the Tosas Chad Mikamai in Yevamos, I mentioned this already, I'm just trying to recap and build up this case more, says, what kind of proof is that? That's not a proof, that's a problem. Meaning, if, let the chips, what do they say, fall where they may. We have a rule called Yikov Hadina Sahar, the law is the law. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu, apparently that was his quality, right? He said, the Rebbeinu Shalom gave us a law, like we said before, this is what has sustained us. And the law is the law, whether it's convenient or inconvenient. So Tos Chad Mikamoi says, I don't understand Rashi. What is Rashi saying? If not, it's inconceivable because otherwise we couldn't rely, on in our own homes on others. But I don't think Rashi meant that. I think what Rashi was trying to say, if you put all three Rashis together, Chulin, Gittin, Yevamos, what Rashi really meant to say was basically all Jews have credibility in Cheskas Kashrus, even Krovim, and even unless somebody is a Nechshad in particular, he's known to not care about this, or he has a bad track record, etc. Otherwise, our halachic humanism, we'll call it, meaning establishes that people are honest and they're credible. And what Rashi's saying is it would be inconceivable to have a system within Torah where you couldn't eat in your own home. Not because it's too hard. It would be hard, but that's not his point. His point is it's just not consistent with the idealism of the halacha of what Jewish society is supposed to be. So Rashi, in contrast to Tosas, doesn't really need a makar, because Tosas starts off being a skeptic, like, prove it to me. Rashi starts off the opposite way, being an idealist and saying, the chiddush is when you do need evidence. When we don't know specifically that you need it, then reliance on people is totally fine. There's no sense in Rashi that this is a concession. Okay, so that is one element. I'm going to take a question in just one more second, but I'm going to try to show in a second that there are 2 or 3 other elements, even in Rashi and Tosas, certainly when you bring in the Ramban, that reinforce this argument, this big argument about how comfortable we are with the credibility of people who we don't even know, never mind people that we do know. Yeah, and a question.
So if I understand correctly, the default position is that everyone is trustworthy in certain
Rashi, for Rashi.
For Rashi.
Yeah.
But what about the person you consider to be trustworthy requires, for example, in the instances where 2 Edim are not required, some knowledge. So, for example, if
Say that one more time.
I'm sorry,
I didn't hear the last few words.
it requires knowledge on the part of the ed. So, if a lot
Maybe
of
halachic knowledge.
yes, because
Yeah,
people
so then you wouldn't. Right.
People back. I mean, a lot of people were illiterate because basically we didn't have books and so on and so forth like today. But the average Joe, so to speak,
Right.
wasn't of an intellectual level in terms
Right,
of.
but to be an
knowledge
aid,
of
you don't
halakha.
necessarily. Right. No, I understand. But I would say this: where legal knowledge or intellectual knowledge is a sine qua non for being accurate and factual, which sometimes it can be, then the absence of that is very problematic and would not, be something that we could just, ignore. But mostly when we're talking about evidence, we're talking about, just honesty. And we're talking about, accurately, I'm going to get to this point in a different way in just a few minutes, but accurately, conveying what you know or what you saw. So if somebody says, this piece of meat, I know for a fact that it came from the kosher butcher shop, not from the, not from the non-kosher butcher shop. That doesn't require knowledge. It doesn't require knowledge of kashrus either. It requires just, factual accuracy, right? Most evidence and most in Eidechonam Bisurim or in evidence in real edus does not require knowledge, intellectual knowledge. Most of it requires just honesty.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I don't want to belabor the point, but it's the problem with edut in general.
Yeah.
I think I mentioned that a few weeks ago, where how reliable, that's it, reliability,
Yeah.
not trustworthiness, but reliability.
So this, I think I mentioned again, but right, this is a big issue. So, for example, we're going to discuss this in a couple more minutes because we're running a little bit late, but we talk about the tashbits, we'll discuss it a little bit more. But I think I mentioned in the past that the Sivas HaMishpat is, which I have here, it's like I think it's the last of the sources in today's sheet. He discusses the question, how come a single witness is not good enough in Dinei Mamonos, in monetary matters. Like if you believe him or you don't believe him, why do you need two? So and the truth is that, I mean, two is still, more reliable than one, but more, let's say, even convincing than one. But let's go back to your reliability. Essentially, the Nesivos says what you're suggesting. And that is, what he says is, we fully believe, from a credibility, honesty point of view, we fully believe the Eid Echad. Not everybody agrees with this, by the way, but this is what he says. We fully believe him. The problem is, do we think he's fully, well, use your language, reliable? Meaning, do we think that, what he's describing, is factually accurate? And the way he puts it is, there's always a little fear of what's called bidadami, that people's imagination, might be taking over, things that they think they saw or know.
The delusion factor.
The delusion factor, exactly. So the bigger idea of the Nesivos, as I've explained it in the past, is, people do not share the same delusions usually, except maybe in politics, but in most things, most people who are delusional are I always quote Tolstoy. It's like a parallel to the Tolstoy, as I've said in the past. In the beginning of the beginning words of Anna Karenina, where he says, all unhappy families are unhappy in different ways. All happy families are happy in the same ways. I don't think it's true. I think the first point is true. I think it's possible the second statement is not true. People's happiness can express itself in different ways. But whatever, it's not my bone to pick at the moment. So I guess my conversion of this is, is that all delusional people are delusional in different ways, or at least typically, except for Papa. So basically, but that's what the Nesiva says without using, this kind of term. He says it's called bidadami. Bidadami means I imagine it to be that, or I think it's that way. So what he says is, what he means is, when you have two witnesses that and they're saying the same thing, they're reporting the same thing, that filters out, the delusional, factor, if you will, because they're not going to both have the same delusion. They'll have different delusions, so therefore they're telling the same exact story, but what emerges from the Nesivos, which is fascinating, is that once you have the two, in a way, you could have relied on either one.
But you didn't know that until you had the two.
Right, exactly. So let me just speak about it now, because it's getting late and I don't know whether I'll have chats later. So this is kind of what the Tashbates, he says something a little bit different. He doesn't say about the delusional aspect, but he also confronts this question. So if everybody could go to that for a minute, because it's a very, as far as I know, not a fully known or appreciated source, but I think it's a really, the Tashbates was a Spanish authority, contemporary of the Rivash. We're talking 14th, 15th century, and Spain, and he has like he entered into kind of a debate with the Rivash, who was his contemporary, about Eid Echad b'misa sabal, meaning the problem of aguna, of relying on a single witness. One of the areas in halacha that you're allowed to rely on a single witness is in misa sabal, to establish, that the woman's husband, was deceased, so that she can, move forward and marry someone else. Let's say only one witness, has come forward, to identify, that he is deceased, or to establish that he is deceased. One person who saw him fall into, Mayim She'elem Sof, or who just saw what happened to him, whatever it is. So as we know, that's a big issue, whether it's Minat Torah, Midrabanan. But anyway, the Rivash and the Tashbates have a very big dispute about this, the parameters of Eid Echad b'misa sabal. And the Tashbates wrote like 6 or 7 different tshuvas, different responsa on this theme. So if you look here, this is on page 5 in the Marmakomos, for those of you who hopefully have it.
Mhm.
I think it's on page 5. It says shut, which means shelotu tshuvot tashbets chelik aleph seminayin zayin. This is something that began in earlier simanim and continues afterwards, but it's part of it. It's like a whole presentation. So he says he analyzes this question. As far as I know, he's the earliest to analyze it so extensively, and some of the things that he says are very fascinating. What is the real credibility status of a single witness? Okay, so he says Hashara Rishon. Everybody have it? Or those who want to have it, have it. The first gate, he's talking about different pra. Mitzad Edos Haidacha. Yesh Ladaktek. Mipnei Ma Posla Torah Haidacha the Mamon. Straightforward. Why is a single witness disqualified, in monetary matters? Why do we need 2 witnesses? So he says, he says, I don't think the reason is because we're worried about falsehood, that he's going to lie. Domar Perak the Pora Perak Kaskas Abatim Zeh Chazem at Starfin, Ukin Hardod, Bein Oda, Char Oda, Bein Oda, Char Halva, Bein Halva, Char Halva, Bein Halva, Char Hoda, mit Starfin, Bimesh Lachosh the Sheker, Kiechet Echad Belachuda Ikalamechash, Achinami Bishnayim. I'll explain in a minute. Shekalechad made Edis Muchedes, Veinit Starfusam, Motzianim, Midech Shasha. Right? Shekalechad made Edis Achas. This is the question that he asks. Even though you require 2 witnesses in monetary matters, right, there is also one flexible element to all that, and that is called edus miyuchedes. Edus miyuchedes has more than one meaning. I'm just going to stick to the one that he's talking about, or extreme one. Let's say one witness was present. Let's say Levi was present when Reuven borrowed $100 from Shimon. Okay, Sunday morning. But he's only one witness, right? Now, let's say Yehuda, another person, also only one witness, was present, not Sunday morning, but Wednesday morning, when Reuven borrowed another $100 from Shimon. Okay? But he's only a single witness. So you have 2 single witnesses, right? One attesting to a transaction between Reuven and Shimon Sunday morning, the other attesting to a transaction between Reuven and Shimon on Wednesday morning, right? Each is basically establishing, with respect to 2 different transactions, right, that Reuven borrowed $100 from Shimon. $100 according to one on Monday and $100 according to the other on Wednesday. So the Gemara says, this is the psak, that when it comes to dine mominus, if it's a monetary din Torah, right, court case, then we accept the testimony of the what's called edus muched. The 2 edim, even though each one is only testifying about as an individual about one transaction, will combine their stories and will charge Reuven with $100, not $200, but $100. The overlap, the common denominator. That's called edus muchedes of halva achar halva, like 2 loan transactions, but one, following the other, where it's 2 different transactions. It's not 2 different reports about the same transaction. So now again, let me make it clear. If we were talking about a matter of ishus, like let's say you had Reuven said, I was at the wedding of these 2 people. I was the only witness Sunday morning. And then the other guy came and said, I was the only witness. I also saw them, exchange vows, or not exchange vows, but we don't do that in halacha. But I also saw the marriage ceremony of these two people on Wednesday morning. Would we combine, the two Eid Echads, to make the answer is no. Let's say Dina Nefashos. Let's say, Ruvain said, Ruvain came to court and testified, that this individual, was involved in a capital offense. And then Shimon came to court 3 days later, also as an individual aid, and, reported the same thing. Would we apply capital punishment on the basis of two witnesses spread over two different infractions? No. We only do this in Dine Mamonis.
But why is that, Rabbi? Because
I'm about to explain.
It speaks to the character of the.
Well, not so much the character. So it's like this: the two single Eidim in Dine Mamonis. This is my explanation. I think the normal explanation, not the Tashbeitz's, as we'll see. Basically, there are two witnesses that Ruvain owes $100 to Shimon. It's true that they're about two different transactions, but they both agree that Ruvain owes Shimon $100. Now, each one speaks about a different $100. If you were believing, each one independently, then you would have to say that Ruvain owes Shimon $200. But the overlap is, it's what we say. There's edus on the chiyuv hagavra, even if there isn't edus on the ma'isa halva. What that means is we have only one witness each on the transaction, but we do have two witnesses on the personal obligation, even though it's across two different transactions. But when it comes to capital offense, that's not good enough. Two people coming to court and saying he is, worthy of capital punishment doesn't work. We only accept testimony about the crime. And since the crime doesn't have neither crime has two witnesses, it's not good enough. That's an added, requirement in capital offenses. Now,
but in having two separate testimonies, so-and-so killed someone else, it makes that person, two people
are saying he's a murderer.
Testifying separately makes him into like the equivalent of a serial killer or an habitual kind of murderer. So it's not out of the realm, if
No, it's not out of the realm. I'm just telling you what the halacha is. The halacha protects, because money is money, and capital punishment is irrevocable, and the stakes are so high. Just like take American law, right? It's the threshold, to even in this, this anti-Semitism, this Pittsburgh, situation. So they found the evil person, involved in this to be guilty, and then there's going to be almost like a separate trial, whether or not they're going to apply the death penalty. I mean, death penalty requires a higher threshold. So that's true in the halacha, as well. Mishnah says in Makos, very famously, it's quoted a lot, sometimes, quoted in a misleading way, but, that some of the Tanoim say, a Bezdin that meets out to capital punishment, once every 7 years, or some people say once every 7 years. It's called like a killer, killer Bezdin, meaning, it's very rare. It's very rare because there are a lot of built-in protections for such a defendant, because we want to make sure that we don't make a mistake. It's somebody's life. Meaning the halacha does believe that capital punishment in halakhic terms is acceptable under certain conditions, but it is also extremely reticent, to apply it, and the threshold is very, very high. Anyways, getting back to but when it comes to Dine Mamanis, a halva, Ruvain owes, everybody agreed. 2 people agree that Ruvain owes $100. That those 2 people are individual witnesses on 2 different transactions. There will combine. So what the Tashbetz is saying, which is so fascinating, is he's saying like this: if you were really worried that one aid wasn't credible enough, if that was the problem, then how do you combine 2 ones, right? In the case of Edus Muchedes, because the 2 ones are, it's not credible enough, plus not credible enough does not credible make. That's the Tashbitz's argument. So he says, you see from Edus Muchedes that the problem in Eid Echad is not credibility. I mean, we don't believe him per se. It must be something else. Because if it were, we don't believe one witness, then, you have 2 ones, you still don't believe them. You don't believe the first one, you don't believe the second one. Right? That's an interesting argument. So then he says, next paragraph, if you look at the next paragraph. Oh, I'm sorry, before we do that, if you look at the bolden lines on the end of the first paragraph, if you're worried about credibility, believability, meaning trustworthiness, I'm talking about. I'm not talking about reliability, trustworthiness of one, even if you have 1,000 individual ones, the kulan ya'idu edus muchedes, they're still all testifying about separate transactions. Lo yischazek ha'emes. It doesn't strengthen the truth. Bishvil kach. Shalakol echad yesh lachush l'shekra, kemo be'echad yechidi she'eno mishid star ifimon. Doesn't matter 1,000 ones or 1. Either way, you have the same problem. Now, the truth is, I'm not sure if that's such a winning argument. Sometimes if you say, oh, somebody's not either reliable or credible, the fact that there is a kind of reinforcement, if 1,000, if even 2 or 3, if different people come to court and they say, Reuven keeps borrowing money from Shimon, it does strengthen, each one does strengthen the other person's case in some respect. Right? I mean, there's a pattern of, both of them are saying Reuven is generous. I'm sorry, Reuven is needy. Shimon is generous. Both of them are claiming that there's a loan, relationship, between them. So I don't know whether the Tashmitz's argument of, 0 plus 0 is still 0, applies. Sometimes, cumulative evidence. Now, again, it's not cumulative in the sense that it's about the same transaction. But what I'm suggesting is there are patterns, even across transactions, that still lend greater stature or weight to certain credibility. But okay, the Tashbetz isn't looking at that way. And it's a very fascinating, but I'll show you what he does in a minute. We're not going to have so much time for much more. But so then in the second paragraph, he says, okay, so what is the problem? If the problem of Eid Echad is not that we don't believe him per se, he's not, credible, so what is the problem? If shalom agamtin do l'shikol chashin and afilu b'chad mishum lo nechshu Yisrael lahoid b'sheker the sheres Yisrael yasu abla ela shegzeras hamelachi, lest you say there's no credibility problem, but there is. The Torah just demands higher standards. Shegzeras hamelach shelo yakom Eid Echad l'kolavon l'kolchatos l'shua u'kamosha pasla krovim afilu l'chovas kroveim upasla Moshe v'Aaron mishum gzeras hamelach. The Tashbetz says maybe just like, if Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron Cohen showed up in court and they wanted to testify, we'd throw them out of court because they're related to each other. Do we really believe that they're not going to tell the truth? These are our heroes, right? We don't think that Moshe and Aaron are not going to tell the truth, but it's a lo klud, meaning it's a there's laws of evidence, and you have to be consistent in applying them. So lest you say that's the idea, you need two witnesses no matter what. So maybe we're not worried that they're lying, but these are the requirements. If shalom archen, Tashbit says can't be. But Perikas shalom, Aisha shalom, Marina babaya, Leidachod b'Muhammad, Leidachod b'Hamnish the Musa b'Dulugye, b'Meshakri. So he says the language of the Gemara implies that when we don't believe in Eid Echad, or we do believe him, it depends whether we think he's telling the truth. So it isn't some formal disqualification. It has to do with relying on him or disqualifying him because you don't have a sufficient threshold of credibility. So ultimately, the Tashbates comes to the following conclusion. He says, "Near Tamo shel davar devada irachol abalahayd bebezin chashasha rechoka lifgon ben bris mukzak." It's only a very distant concern that maybe, he's not telling the truth. We don't really worry about that so much. Aval mikomokom efshar shu made sheker leman shesachorhu mash ein lachshod bazeh shnei edim ksherim shein lachshod klal lezera bruchi Hashem shehu chatzufim kolkach shelo yizbaishu zeh mizeh kivin shein muchazakim bekashrus. He says something really interesting. He says, we're not worried that people are not going to tell the truth per se, but we are worried that they can be corrupted. Meaning that somebody with an interest in the case might want to, engage in a little bit of bribery, what is it they say? Witness tampering, right? So that we're worried about. We're not worried that people are going to lie per se. We're worried that interested parties might corrupt the system.
But
How does two help you? Two helps you, he says, because this is vulnerable at a practical level. I think idealistically, it's a very nice idea. He says, it's one thing, for somebody to be corrupted. It's quite something else, to collude with another aide, and both of you to be corrupted, meaning that much, there's a modicum of dignity. He's saying that a kosher aide has, that if he's going to be corrupted, he's not going to be corrupted, together with a partner. The second that there's partners involved, he's going to be motivated, to be idealistic, and to operate with the integrity required of an aide. So if that's the case, he says, so basically, whenever you have two aidim, we're not worried about corruption because each one filters that out of the other from a it's not acceptable, behavior. So if you're going to be, corrupted, privately, that's one thing. But, corrupted, with collusion with someone else, that people won't do. And consequently, whenever there are two witnesses, you filter out the, toxic, concern. But then, listen to this, then you're back to the fundamental credibility of even a single aide. So if that's the case, it's very similar to the Nesivos, but the Nesivos said bidadami. The Nesivos said, listen, people are delusional in different ways. So we can filter out the delusion when there are two people. The Tashbitz is saying, the problem of Eid Echad is the problem of corruption. And corruption is filtered out when there's more than one person, who's the object of it. But if that's the case, then you get to a situation, let's say you have two, now he's explaining how does Edus Muchedes work. Edus Muchedes, meaning Ruvain saw the loan on Sunday morning. Shimon saw a second loan, but a parallel one on Wednesday morning. How is it that we, will combine their testimony? Says the Tashbetz, we're combining their testimony. If you look at on the paragraph number 4, he says, "Lefizeh yeshomar shatama yitztarfus b'zeh achar zeh afilu b'halva acharvo shezeh ha'ed arishon chezkaso sheina meshaker elo shehuksha lanu lahotzi mamon al piv shminei chashash rachok shem meshaker hu ukeshabayid echad v'heid af al pi shal mana acher heid avikol makom chiyuv mamon heid l'sayeh l'rishon b'chiyuvo." Halkein begilui muad kazeh ichzaknuhu bekashras. The Sarah me'olav osok shasha rachoka. He says something very amazing. He says, really, from a pure credibility point of view, Eidachon would be enough. The only thing is we're worried about this corruption angle, is we're not worried about the corruption of two different individuals. And therefore, if they're both telling a similar story, they reinforce each other. It's not what I said before, which is the normal way of understanding Eidos Miuchedes, which is the common denominator is, even though we don't have two witnesses on the transaction, we have two witnesses that A owes a certain amount of money to B. Who cares if it's multiple transactions? That's still a common denominator. That's not how the Tashbetz learns. Tashbetz says, if you have one witness on one transaction, one witness on the other transaction, we believe the first one, because by virtue of the reinforcement of the second, you eliminate the obstacle. And once you eliminate the obstacle, Eidachon is Nemon, even b'mamon. Ad kedei kach, that the Tashbetz has a hard time explaining why you don't say you believe the first one and you believe the second one. Why don't you charge him $200? Right? Ruvain says on Sunday morning he saw a loan of $100. Shimon says on Wednesday morning I saw a loan of $100. If you say the reason is the common denominator, even though it's not on one transaction, it's on, the personal obligation of one to the other, then you can only go by the common denominator, and that's the overlapping $100. But if the idea, according to the Tashbetz, is that when you get a similar story, you're not worried about the corruption angle, and then the Eidos of an Eid Echad can be Motzi Mamon. So then your question is, why aren't we charging, Reuven with $200? Because each one reinforces the other, and therefore each Eid Echad is sufficient, and therefore you have Eid Echad on 100, and you have another Eid Echad on another 100. You should obligate him with 200. So the Tashbetz is bothered by that, and he says, all this is a chiddush. We're not going to push it more than we have to. Okay, but the upshot of all this, just give me one more minute because we're running out of time, is when he comes to the if you turn the page, is when he comes to Eidachon Nemon B'Yisurim. So he says on the beginning of page 6, B'nir the Hainu Tamad Eidachon Nemon B'Yisurim. The hashta hi chashasha rechoka she'inu choshin dilma meshaker leika lemechish B'Yisurim. So he says something that is absolutely astonishing. He basically says, really, Eid Echad has the wherewithal objectively to be believed even in Mamon, if not for the possibility of corruption, right? Corruption comes about when there's another party has an interest. I mean, there are two Balei Dvarim. Let's say you have a Din Torah about Mamon, you have Reuven and Shimon, they each have interests. So we're worried that somebody's going to bribe or corrupt, tamper with the witnesses. But usually there's no problem or no concern about tampering or corruption in Isurim. Although I could probably find a case where there could be, obviously. But, all things being equal, if we're talking about low-level, numbers anyway. Can you eat this piece of meat? Did it come from the kosher butcher shop? In the end of the day, who's the other party? Right? So what he says is, Eidachon Nemon B'Yisurim is not, until now we've been discussing this question. Eidachon Nemon B'Yisurim is a lower standard. You don't need to be a kosher aid. You don't need to, it doesn't have to be in Bezdin. Right? We're wondering, is that a concession? And we're not really so reliant on it, but what can we do? Or no, for what it is, we accept it and we're confident about it. But the Tashbetz goes even further. ironically, what the Tashbitz is saying is, Eid Echad Nemon B'Isurim is exactly a Eid Echad B'Mamon. Why does it work if it doesn't work in Mammon? The answer is it works in Isurim the way it should have worked in Mammon, because there's no factor that obstructs it. So Isurim is exactly like Mammon without the side distraction of corruption. So according to the Tashbetz, actually, the paradigm of Eid Echad Neman is Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim. Turns everything on its head. The Balei Tosas think that Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim without a makar, and now they go further. Let's say it's Chazak Yisura. Let's say you're trying to override a status quo ante, with an Eid Echad. So the Balei Tosas say you can't do that. That's the Gemara. Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim doesn't work connected as Chazak Yisura. Then Balei Tosas go further. They're saying, you know what? Maybe it doesn't even work to prohibit. Maybe it only works to permit. We talked about that a little bit last week. It only works lehatera, not leisur, because Balei Tosas have a certain view. They think Eid Echad, really is not fully either reliable or credible, and the fact that it works in Isurim needs a makar. And even then, it's under pressure. And if there are counter pressures like is Chazak Yisura or Hetera versus Yisura, maybe we'll believe it in one direction and not in the other. But according to Rashi and according to the Ramban and according to the Rajba, they think an Echad Neman B'Yisurim is totally reliable. Rashi doesn't think you even really need a makar, right? Because people are just reliable, incredible. And the Ramban says, even again, it's Chazak Yisura. And Ramban and Rajba say, it doesn't matter if it's Latera or Lisura. Why would you make a distinction? We believe him. If you believe somebody, then you're not going to distinguish between Latera and Lisura, right? Because you just believe them. You believe them no matter what they say. You're not a fair weather, believer. If you're saying, it's only probability, it doesn't reach the point of certainty, you can say, I'm going to apply a probability in this direction, but not in that direction. But if you really believe them, you believe them. But then the Tashbetz comes along and says, not only is Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim reliable, it's exactly like Eid Echad B'Mamon, without the distraction or the risk of corruption. It ends up being, you don't even need props. You don't even need Edus Miuchedes. It's stronger than Eid Echad B'Mamon, in fact. So not only is Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim not a different category, and even though it's karov, all that's okay too, because that's a very remarkable view of the Tashbetz. Yeah, there was a question before.
Yeah, I just, this is on a conceptual level, why we make the distinction between truthfulness and corruption, because corruption leads.
So what we're saying is we believe.
Lying.
Right. No, what we're saying is, unless somebody interferes, and motivates, and instigates, you can believe what people say. There are two different issues, right? One is like, are people honest? All things being equal, when you ask them something, are they going to give you an honest answer? Then there's a second question, and that is, are they, and to, on what level are they corruptible? That's really what Tashbetz is saying. The first discussion of the Tashbetz is, are they reliable / credible? Are you going to get, should you be worried that people are just, they're just going to lie to you for no reason? Because they don't care, or they're troublemakers, or they'll say they know when they don't know, they don't know when they do know, even without any kind of benefit. So that's one issue. Are people inherently, credible or not? On that, he's taking an issue, absolutely. And he's saying, in the end of the day, that Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim, that's all we care about, because he doesn't think there's a corruption factor there. As far as being corruptible, that he doesn't think is likely either, but he says that is a chashash rachok, That's, a threshold. You have to worry about that. But you don't have to worry about it in cases where there's reinforcement because two people are telling similar story, even in a different transaction. And you certainly don't have to worry about it in Isurim because the motivation for corruption, is not there, or it's much less because you're not talking about a competition between two sides, etc. But the irony is, so Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Isurim turns out to be the formidable credibility of an Eid Echad that, Eid Echad, in Besdin could have been, if not for, these other extraneous factors. And you contrast that with Tosas, and even with Rashi and Ramban, they don't say that. So you end up with a very fascinating range of views about, how where Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Isurim stands, vis-a-vis formal Eidos. I'm just going to mention a couple of other issues that are connected to this because we're going to have to stop in a minute. But was there a follow-up?
So basically, it boils down to whether there's a case, a corruptibility or not. If it's unlikely to be corruptible, therefore, Eid Echad is sufficient.
Right. As opposed to saying Eid Echad is never sufficient. You need two because we have a very high threshold. It doesn't mean we think every individual is dishonest, but there are enough people for whatever reason who aren't going to give you a correct answer or aren't going to admit that they, that they don't know when they know when they don't know or don't know when they know, and so on. That's the yeah. So as I said, the question of Eid Echad B'Isurim and where it stands in this whole hierarchy is a fascinating question. I mentioned last time that I'm just going to mention it again. The Rambam has a particularly interesting, application of all this, and that is, let's say, Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Isurim, meaning a factual determination about something's status. Let's say it ends up having an impact on an ownership. Or on Mammon, meaning, once that fact is accepted, so it is consequential, for other Dinei Torah. For example, this is what the Rambam says in Hilchos Sanhedrin, Perek Tazayin Halacha Vav. The Rambam says that if an Eid Echad will come to court and say the meat on the table here is treifa meat, right? And he was saying that in a vacuum. You just wanted to know, let's say the Dayanim are sitting there, there's a piece of chicken and they're hungry and they want to know if they can eat, right? So an Eid Echad is there and he says, I know, I saw it came from the treifa butcher shop, right? Now, what happens if somebody else picks it up and says, I'm going to eat it? And then let's assume even that you give them, I say, what the Eid Echad just established that it's treifa meat. And you're not allowed to eat it. And if you eat it, maybe you'll even get malchus, whatever. And he says, I don't care, I'm eating it. Right? And then he eats it. So the Rambam says he'll get malchus. He'll be punished. Why? Even though if the timing had been different, says the Rambam, let's say there was a court case, in which this fact was consequential monetarily or in some other way for Malchus or for Misa, we wouldn't accept the testimony of an Eid Echad because it's beneath the threshold of what we need for these kind of cases. However, says the Rambam, if a person or an object was huchsak al yedei Eid Echad prior to the violation or the infraction, and then knowingly, right, it was a vehicle for a transgression or an infraction, right? Even though if the source is Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Isurim, once this is accepted to be fact, then we're confident about it, and we treat it, in a factual way. Even with respect to Dinei Torah that have a higher threshold. Now, let me make it clear. if you held that Eid Echad Nem Bisurim was some sort of a compromise, or, B'deleis Breira, like we have no choice, but we're not really, as they say, confident enough that it really is accurate, would you ever apply it to cases where the threshold was higher? Certainly not. But if we think with confidence that it's true, right, even though, it doesn't attain, the threshold of edus, then if it gets into the court's, system through the back door, it's still a fact. So that's the Rambam. That the Rambam says this. Most people take it at face value. The Mishnah Melech and the Shef Shmaitza both kind of reread that Rambam, meaning they said, no, the Rambam didn't mean that if the Eid Echad establishes that this is Chalev or Treifa, then you eat it knowingly that you'll get punished. He meant if he made that statement and then for 30 days or so, let's say it was huchsak that way, like everybody was saying, this is treifa meat, this is treifa meat, this is treifa meat, this, I don't think they don't have to repeat it. It's like a mantra. But meaning what I'm saying is it was accepted without dispute for a certain period of time. So it's not just the Eid Echad B'Yisurim. It's Eid Echad B'Yisurim huchsak. The Ram uses language, that when the Eid Echad establishes that this is Caleb, it's huchsak al yidei Eid Echad. So I think most people read the Rambam. The way I read the Rambam is, but the Rambam saying the Eid Echad, he gets in through the back door, and this is established as fact. The Mishnah Melech, because of another Rambam that he had trouble with, squaring them, assume that the word huchsak al yidei echad doesn't mean the Eid Echad establishes it. It means if the Eid Echad establishes it and it's followed by a time period in which this is accepted without dispute, I mean it's huchsak after the Eid Echad, right? Then you could be lokeh, and so on. So really, there's a fundamental argument about that. But certainly, this has to do a lot with this question. I'll give you, I mentioned I think last time another one, but there are a number of many issues actually. But I think I mentioned last week the concept of a masla, just to repeat for a minute, which is that when it comes to edus, testimony in court, speak now or you shall ever, what is it, hold your peace. They say that about the marriage, but let's say in testimony, kivin shehigid, we discussed this. Kivin shehigid shuvin echozer magid. Edom will come to court and they testify. They can't come back the next day and say, we didn't really mean it. We were anusim, right? Mostly, unless they have a peshas and peshahit here, we say you can't recant your testimony once you give it. And the thinking behind that is that if we're treating your testimony, with such gravity, we're considering it to be factual and so on and so forth, then there are consequences to that. That is mutually exclusive with the idea that it's an open book and it can be recanted. You can't both, assign factual status to something and be flexible, about its, being recanted at the same time. So that's one explanation. But when it comes to Eid Echad Nem B'Yisurim, right? Let's say the aide came to court and he said, this is a treifa meat. And then the next day he came to court and said, you know what, I was under a lot of pressure yesterday when I said that, but it isn't true. So do we believe him? Or do we say the equivalent of kivin shigit shuvin chazer magid? Like the more, on the one hand, there's no bezin aspect, which may formalize or open a statute of limitations on the opportunity to recant. And certainly its impact is less. On the other hand, the more you consider it, certain, until it's not, until the suspicion, you might have the same kind of problem, if that really was a problem, namely, part of this, treating something, giving it, the weight of credibility is that you can't keep tampering with it. You can't keep tweaking it. So it's an interesting question. The Gemara, the Mishnah, and the Gemara really, in Ksuvas on Daf Chabei, Somet Aleph, does say that there's something called an amasla, but the Gemara has it in case of what we call shavi nafshe chaticha d'isur. This is what the Gemara that we read last time. The Gemara says that if a woman, is being sought after, she's being, people are courting her or whatever, so or proposing to her. So she says, the Gemara tells the case that somebody proposed to this woman, and she said, I really wish I could accept your proposal, but look, she showed her ring or whatever, I'm married already. So and the Gemara says, then a week later, she invited everybody to her wedding. So everybody said, what? You said a week ago you were already married. So she says, well, the person who was pursuing me was very aggressive, or I didn't want to hurt his feelings, or as the case may be. So that's what I said, but it isn't true, right? Now that I got a better or an appropriate, proposal, so, now I'm telling the truth. That's called an amasla. So that's in case of shavya nafshe chaticha de'isura, we call it. The Gemara says that if a person, it says that, they are off limits, or they, that's called shavina. She makes herself into a chaticha shalisar by saying, I'm an eshasish. She takes herself off the marriage block. But, says the Gemara, you don't say kivin shigit shuvin nechozer magid for that. You'll say, hino senes amasla al dvarah. So the Chachamim Provence debate, what about Yachad Neman B'Yisurim? It's more than Shavinav Shechaticha D'Yisura. It's more than her saying about herself that she is off limits. Somebody else is saying about something that it is prohibited, or someone that they are prohibited, etc. It's, more objective. On the other hand, it's very short of ages. So does that Kivin Shigit Shuvin Nechozer Magid, or is that Yachad Neman B'Yisurim? Is that no sin amaslo l'dvaraha? So there are numerous other issues. Does it make a difference if the Eid Echad B'Yisurim is somebody who could be a witness? For example, a man, not a woman, a rachok, not a karov, not somebody who's related. Are there levels in Eid Echad Naman B'Yisurim, a hierarchy within that? For example, we find the din of Ula is that when it comes to cases of Sota, Egla Rufa, Misa Sabal, the Aguna case that we spoke about before, there we have a rule called Kol Makom She'emina Torah Einachad Arei Kan Shnayim, that whenever the Torah accepts the testimony of a single witness, it can't be disputed even by another single witness unless it's disputed at the same time, simultaneously. That's a din of Ula. So these three cases, Eid Echad b'Misa Sabal, Eid Echad b'Sota, meaning when she is suspected of adultery, Eid Echad b'Egla Rufa, these three cases have this special din. Do other Eid Echad B'Yisurim have that din? That Kol Makom She'emina Torah Echad Arei Kan Shnayim, that whoever gets there first is treated as if they're, full Eidim? So the Ritva in Yavamos says no, and the Marik and others say why not? So our time is up, but just to sum up, what we've seen is a very full, nuanced range of how we look at Eid Echad Naman B'Yisurim. Echad Naman B'Yisurim, we have to understand, this is such a pivotal, it's an invisible presence in all of our lives. Testimony is memorable and discernible. You go to court, you get, Drisha v'chakira, you get interrogated. There are rules in court. You're standing in the presence, of judges, who have stature and who mean something. It's a rare occurrence, and it's, I wouldn't say traumatic, but I'll say it's memorable, and it is, intimidating. It's certainly an experience. Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim is the invisible presence in our lives. Every single day we're relying on Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim is about, if you don't know every, detail, surrounding your halachic life, then, and in order to, save time, in some cases, not just efficiency, in order to be able to utilize something or to experience something, there has to be some reliance on the credibility of other people. That we don't think of it as going to court because it's not, but that's an invisible, ubiquitous issue in our life. That's called Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. Every time I whether I ask and I get an answer, or I'm just, assuming, that, something, that is in somebody's kitchen or and so on is beyond reproach, etc. Implicitly, I'm relying on Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. So the question of how we perceive that, whether it's a concession and what would justify that concession, whether it is, the absolute equivalence of testimony and witnesses, with the, adjustment only being what the stakes are, or the kind of category that it is, or many shades in between, the different perspectives on how we look upon this reliance is very critical. It's critical in terms of practice, and whether we should be seeking more idealistic, standards and not relying in some cases, etc. But it's also philosophically important in terms of this question of the default perspective on other people that we interact with.
Hello.
We have a suspicious,
okay?
or more of a trusting
I didn't know.
default,
I didn't.
respect
Oh,
for
I
their
just keep
credibility.
concentrating on this.
Okay. Anyway, so we're going to stop here. I think that is an interesting legal,
Almost over.
philosophical
It's the-
question, one which
Yeah,
touches on a lot of the
almost
issues we've
over for the
discussed,
season. But it's
all
the last
year,
few minutes. I
which
just
is,
want to make it-
the standards and the requirements of Gittin, which is a crucial, obviously, personal status. Ishus, being something which defines someone, and the demands of evidence and credibility and all the various requirements that protect that institution, and that inject a greater element of confidence, which a dover should be kedusha, definitely requires. So I want to wish everybody a good summer, and as I say, we'll continue or start. Probably in the beginning of September, I'm guessing. We'll learn Masechet Yevamos, which is also a very, very fascinating limud. And we look forward to to continuing with the group going forward. I think next year the suggestion has been made, to at least maybe special occasions, at least, that we should return to meet in person in the synagogues. Is it done? Is it refurbished? Is it already up and running? The shuls? No. I'm seeing skepticism.
There's no, they have not yet had the grand opening.
Okay. But I think the suggestion was made to me. I don't know if this is the final, but at least we're weighing like the possibility that, before Chagim, at least, etc., that maybe we'll try, to have some.
Nice. Yes.
Or maybe a combination of the two. But either way, we look forward to seeing you all next year. And this is a Wednesday, so this is like a unique day of the week. So those who weren't able to make it, please send them my best as well. And we look forward to resuming, after the summer. So
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank
Good to
you.
see you.
Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Good to see